Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 2022 Gifted Education Policy Symposium and Conference Reflecting on Giftedness, hosted by the Office of the Daniel L. Ritchie Endowed Chair in Gifted Education at the University of Denver. And thank you to our 2022 GEPSC Emerald sponsors, CAGT, the Colorado Association for Gifted and Talented, Gifted Unlimited, and Think Law. Hello and welcome to our panel, Experiences Being Highly and Profoundly Gifted. Our three panelists are myself, Joy Lynn, a doctoral student at the University of Denver, Dr. Chris Wells, a therapist and researcher, and Inth Barfields, founder of Elysian Trust. We will each have 2 minutes to respond to 7 prompts: our introductions, educational experiences, health, social and emotional intelligence, intuition, talent development and career exploration, and finally, saving the world in hopes for the future. We'll have to talk fast. Let's get started with introductions. I'll go first for each prompt, followed by Chris, then Inth. I'm Joy. I use she, her pronouns and really resonate with the concept of being two-spirit. As a child, I identified as half Black and half Taiwanese, but 23andMe clarified I'm about 50% Chinese, a third African, and an eighth European. I was born in Okinawa, Japan, adopted and naturalized in the United States. My dad is a retired Marine officer, and my mom is about to retire as a guidance counselor. I've learned how special it is that both of my Black boomer parents earned graduate degrees and how privileged my life has been. I've lived in the Deep South, Okinawa, the Midwest, and the UK. I transferred to Colorado for undergrad in 2004, worked as a math teacher, curriculum trainer, organizer with a teachers union, and am currently a fourth-year PhD student of gifted education leadership here at the University of Denver. Years after leaving the classroom, I knew nothing about giftedness or my own, until 2015 when I tested in the 98th and 99th percentile on the Wonderlic and the Old Mensa admissions test. A social person now very curious about G, I used my scores to join Mensa and Intertel, two high IQ social organizations. In 2019, I tested at 148 IQ or the 99.94th percentile on the WAIS-4. Now I could also prove eligibility for the 999 Society and Volant through Elysian Trust, though not the Prometheus Society, which requires the 99.997th percentile. Like Lita Hollingworth, I'm fascinated by my high IQ, emotionally and intellectually intense, very gifted fringe. I've been hesitant to state I'm profoundly gifted, though others assert I absolutely am. Either way, when I work with amazing people like Chris and Inth, I'm so aware of their even moreness. My ignorance about giftedness has grown into passion for supporting the career development and well-being of the gifted and the professionals who support us. Chris?
Thanks, Joy. First, I want to say that I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate on this panel. My name is Chris Wells. I use she, they pronouns. I'm a therapist and consultant in private practice in Colorado, and I work with gifted and twice exceptional adults. I'm the co-host of the Positive Disintegration podcast, and I'm the president of the Dabrowski Center, which is a new nonprofit dedicated to promoting mental health from the perspective of Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration. I'm 48 years old, and I grew up in Connecticut, and I learned about my high IQ when I was 14 and in the 8th grade. I was suicidal at the time, and the guidance department intervened, and my counselor shared my IQ score with me, which was in the 99.99th percentile, and they allowed me to read my file and see all of my educational and testing history. And they told me that I was special and that I shouldn't kill myself because I had the potential to do great things. My experience of being profoundly gifted has meant feeling like I'm an alien for most of my life. And it wasn't until I discovered the gifted community in my 40s that I felt like I belonged in this world. I generally don't go around identifying myself as profoundly gifted, but somehow people are finding me, and most of the clients I work with are highly and profoundly gifted, and often with at least one other exceptionality. I actually identify as 2E and as an ADHDer as well. It's been my privilege to work with Michael Bihovsky for the past several years, and he's become my mentor and friend. It was discovering Dabrowski's theory and overexcitability that helped me understand myself better than I did before. And learning that there's a meaningful psychological difference in being more than 3 standard deviations from the norm has also helped. Nth.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, my name is Enf Barfield. I use any pronoun that you're comfortable with. They're all good with me. I'm obviously African American, but like Joy, I took a DNA test and I discovered that, as with the majority of African Americans, it's pretty much a mix there. Aside from West African, specifically Nigeria, there's substantial amount of East Asian, South Asian, Jewish, and Native American ancestry through my bloodlines. My IQ journey is a little bit different than most people's. When I was a kid, I took the school's administered IQ test and I scored 90 on it, which I thought was an A minus. I later on learned that was not the case. And it did somewhat impact my life. So I wound up being held back quite a bit until around 10th grade, when I had a teacher intervene on my behalf, and she was aware that something wasn't right. I wasn't in the right classes. After enough testing as a teen and as an adult, it was a vastly different story. I wound up maxing every IQ test they would give me. That included the Wonderlic, the Ravens, Advanced Progressive Matrices, the Wechsler. You get the idea. There's quite a bit. In terms of what my adult IQ score is, they don't actually know. I've been in studies for it, and all they know is that I max out on for most things. I created Legion Trust because I realized that there's a lot of people out there who had gifted abilities, not necessarily IQ, although that's certainly one of them, but they could have a combination of skills and they weren't being nurtured. They were rotting on the vine. So I realized if we could create an organization that could support them, we could build them up and help them with whatever their journey or mission would be, and then they could build up their communities from within. So a lot of our members, well, they're all gifted in one way or the other, but many have other cognitive trade-offs like dyslexia, like me, or ADHD or autism or something like that. And a lot of us come from underrepresented communities. So we are an untapped resource, and we're starting to see the fruits of our labor. So many of our members are going places that at an accelerated pace, and that's because we're supporting each other. Thanks, Joy.
Next up, highlights from our educational experiences. I attended small private religious schools from preschool through my junior year of college. I wonder what my STEM and life potential would have been had I received accurate science and history education. About 95% of my teachers were white and mostly female, and I feel that usually 1 to 2 teachers a year would notice me and try to do something extra. A week into first grade, my teachers advocated for me to skip to 3rd grade. When I said the 3rd grade boys looked at me funny, they placed me in 2nd, but had me take 3rd grade math and reading. I wish someone had encouraged the full 2-grade skip and explained giftedness to me then. Everything was fine in the 3rd grade classroom, except my hand cramped from extra writing. My small high school had flexibility to creatively schedule me for more advanced math courses. My teachers did not seem to know about giftedness and never taught me about my gifted self. While accelerated, teachers didn't differentiate further, though I did get special opportunities, such as my 4th grade teacher inviting me to space camp after I'd entered 5th grade, or my 10th grade math teacher nurturing my potential as an educator who let me teach a week-long geometry unit to my class. In middle school, when a student broke down after getting a B, I told myself I would never get that wound up over grades. I thought I was normal, just smart, and didn't understand why I was punished with extra work, like having to read Hawking's Theory of Everything in science class. With intentionally no studying and very little sleep, I took the SATs once my junior year, scored high enough that I didn't have to take them again, and still got into every college I applied to and qualified as a National Achievement finalist. In higher ed, my multipotentiality became an issue. In undergrad, I was on academic probation in 2 different schools, before finishing with a degree in math and secondary education, and dropped out of 2 master's programs before finishing with an MS in industrial and organizational psychology. I studied math because it was the most challenging subject for me, and wonder how life would have been different had I pursued my strengths instead. Chris?
I was a very precocious kid, but also very asynchronous. My emotional intensity caused a lot of problems for me. And even though I was identified as a gifted kid and placed in a pullout program, no one ever talked with me about what it meant to be gifted beyond the label or beyond academic achievement. Even that day I mentioned when my guidance counselor told me about my IQ and explained that I was an extreme outlier, it was all done in external terms. There was never any discussion about the inner experience of giftedness. I was always set apart from the other children. It always felt like there were different rules for me compared to everybody else. I still have this clear memory of filing into the classroom at the beginning of 5th grade and my teacher saying about me proudly, "I have a genius in my class this year," to the other 5th grade teachers. The expectations from having that label were crushing for me as a child. And by the time I was in middle school, I could barely deal with it. And then I started hearing things from the opposite direction. And when I made mistakes or was imperfect, they would say, "I thought you were supposed to be some kind of genius." And I became an academic underachiever. I always had leadership roles when I was a teenager, but I really didn't care about academics. In 2014, when I was a doctoral student, I did an autoethnography and I studied my life from a research perspective. I wanted to get a better understanding of my past and some of the struggles that I've been through. And I learned that the thing that helped me the most wasn't my intellectual ability. It was having people who were there for me. I've had a remarkable number of people in my life who supported me, and that has really made all the difference. Nth?
Thanks, Chris. As the name implies, nth, I was a mental calculator as a kid. Before I even started kindergarten, I could do these large calculations, and my mom thought it was interesting, but beyond that, there wasn't a whole lot to it. However, when I started kindergarten, I had to do math in the way that they call it showing your work. And I was dyslexic, so I would often flip numbers. So even though I could do these really advanced calculations, I was considered behind. So just because I couldn't show my work. And later on in high school, I have this experience where the answer to a question would just pop in my head and I'd write it down and it would be right. And I get 100% for having the right answer and 0% for showing the work. So I'd often get an F, even though every answer was right. Later on, as I mentioned before, I had a 10th grade teacher. It was her first year as a math teacher. She came to the United States from India, and she thankfully didn't have a filter that the administrative institution had against me. So she didn't see what they thought was like, oh yeah, he's black, he's not going to do very well in school, they don't do well. She just saw, well, this is odd. He can do these really abnormal things, and yet he's so many years behind. That doesn't make any sense. So we worked to get me into honors and advanced classes. Our school administration actually tried to stop us. They said they were afraid I would fail if I took too hard classes. So we had to come up with a strategy to work around them, and it worked. By 12th grade, I was like advanced physics, advanced calculus, so forth and so on. And that was a large part due to someone being a champion for me. And that was in the case of this teacher, and it was Mrs. Madra. After that, it changed the trajectory of my life because I was supposed to be like going to maybe community college and being a mechanic or something like that. Instead, I wound up being a nuclear engineering technologist and later on data analyst. And I'm just really grateful that there was someone who could intervene because not everyone has that. Aside from that, I have to say that a lot of times in college, I often had to find my own path. I think it's the case for a lot of people like me, is we realize there's no specific major for us. We need to craft our own. So that's also a part of my journey as well. And I suspect, again, that it reflects a lot of other people's. Thanks, Joy.
Next up, health. I'm extremely open to experience. I would taste nearly everything in the world at least twice if I could. Even when I dislike something, I'm always so curious about why others do enjoy it. However, I'm resistant to addictions. I never wanted to be desperate for something I couldn't have. I exhibit all of the overexcitabilities, and learning about Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration helped change my life toward the better. In 2017, I had exceptionally low levels of vitamin D3 and neurological issues, which isn't uncommon for browner people, especially those who move north and primarily work inside. My life improved drastically when I started taking about 5,000 units of vitamin D3 most days and worked more on nutrition and hydration. I worry about coating darker skinned people with lots of sunscreen, especially young children during recess. I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression in undergrad, but blew off the recommendations for more sunshine. I think my D deficiency and later my neurological and autoimmune issues exacerbated my struggles in school. At the time, though, I made some big life changes, and those greatly alleviated my depression. When I was so sick in 2017, after 10 days of steroids as a side effect, I wanted to die. Technically, I had suicidal ideation in high school. One might need to know how they would, but I'm pretty positive, resilient, and future focused, so I've never actually wanted to commit suicide. Regarding relationships, all of my serious romantic relationships, including my fiance, have been highly intelligent and gifted. Other people just don't get me the same way. Though Mensa has expanded my social circle, I still yearn for deeper and truer friendships. Chris?
Thanks, Joel. Well, like I said, I was a very intense kid emotionally, and the construct of overexcitability is really the best way to understand what I was like when I was growing up. I struggled with emotional regulation, and I developed an imaginal world when I was nearly 8 that lasted into adulthood. It was like I was living in two realities simultaneously, one real and one imaginal. And now I realize that this is something that takes a certain cognitive capacity to experience. But when I was young, I believed it was a sign of mental illness. Before I even left high school, I had purchased my own copy of the DSM and was searching for answers in psychiatry. And it's because I never fit in. I mean, I wasn't like anyone else. And I took this to mean that there was something wrong with me. I was suicidal regularly throughout adolescence, and I had a complete mental breakdown when I was 21. I made 2 suicide attempts, and I ended up in the hospital. And I went on disability for mental illness at 23 and basically became a professional mental patient until I finally turned things around when I was 26. So I mentioned that I did the autoethnography in 2014, and that's when I discovered Michael's work and Dabrowski's theory. And at the time, I was still thinking of myself as mentally ill. And finding the field of gifted education and learning about the theory has truly changed my life. It's been very liberating for me to realize that the things that make me different are actually gifts. Until I had the theory to make sense of my experiences, I only had the lens of mental illness through which to view my struggles. And it's quite clear now in middle age that it wasn't really mental illness that I was dealing with. And so I'm grateful to have a better framework for understanding my life. And
Thanks, Chris. I got to tell you, I did not experiment with drugs, even though I was in an environment that had quite a bit of them around. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I already had a very overactive imagination, like a lot of gifted people did. So there was no desire for mind-altering drugs. Plus, I came from a very religious family at the time. In terms of physical health, the biggest issue I've had that's directly connected to my brain's wiring is almost certainly sleep deprivation. I've been in something around 20 sleep studies because I can stay awake for up to 72 hours straight, and they aren't sure why. The best that can come up is with, oh, well, high IQ people, people tend to have anxiety, and that can interfere with sleep. In terms of relationships, I was one of those people who did not believe in the whole concept that you could that you need someone in your life who's at least 2 standard deviations close to you. If it's beyond that, there'll be communication issues. After enough experimenting, I have to reluctantly accept that there is some truth to that. At least it was in my case. So I'm still navigating that aspect of the of giftedness and with relating to emotional health. Aside from that, like Joy, I'm also on vitamin D3. And again, it's something that I think a lot of the, especially gifted kids who are dark skinned, is something they probably need to keep an eye on just because it does affect your cognition as well. Thanks, Joy.
Let's move on to social and emotional intelligence. One of my Clifton strengths is wooing new acquaintances, but I've found few deep friends that actually try to and ever do actually get to know my inner self. I notice so much social and emotional data and eventually realize others don't notice or ruminate on things like I do. I strongly feel when people are not a good connection, and while I don't always perform gracefully in social situations, I can usually completely analyze and evaluate and generate ways I could have handled things differently. Another of my Clifton strengths is empathy. As a child, I read a lot of stories which honed my perspective-taking skills. I can usually rapidly lay out perspectives of different stakeholders and possible paths to either escalate or de-escalate situations based on different desired outcomes. I can also usually break down the tensions and ratios of my own emotional states or how I might feel if a particular event occurred. I'll also show a moment of unilevel disintegration. In college, a close religious friend came out to me, and I cried, telling him that he was going to go to hell. He cried, asking if God is love, then why was it wrong for him to love who he loved? I got very quiet and couldn't muster a good answer. This was a huge turning point for me, re-examining messages I'd had hammered into me through my conservative evangelical upbringing. While I rarely cry or feel troubled about myself, I am deeply concerned about our society and world as a whole. Especially after 23andMe, I feel connected to all of humanity and ache when we harm ourselves, each other, our environment, and our futures. George, Sandra, Brianna, Elijah, Tigray, Ukraine, COVID deaths, and our deep fighting over what is truth and what is our purpose. These all make me ache and inspire me to do more and do something to help us all. Chris?
Thanks, Drew. I started writing a journal every day when I was 16, and from that point on, I was always writing and trying to be a better person. I was an introspective kid, and that hasn't changed in adulthood. I've cultivated my emotional intelligence as best I can, and writing about my life allows me to have insight into the mistakes I make, especially with other people. I wasn't one to worry about what other people thought of me, but one of the things that I've really struggled with throughout my life is gender. I've always been a gender nonconforming person, and this is something that was somewhat torturous for me when I was young. I've only recently come out as non-binary, and it's an ongoing process of becoming more comfortable with who I am and being my authentic self in the world. Part of why Dabrowski's theory has resonated so much for me is that the drive I've had to develop and become my authentic self and to try and be a better person and live my values are well captured by his work. I mean, my emotional development is still unfolding, of course, and I'm sure that there are more times of positive disintegration ahead of me, but it's helped. It's helped recognizing myself as a neurodivergent person. This was a major revelation for me in my 40s, and it's allowed me to be more comfortable with myself. And all of this inner work I've done has made it possible for me to help other gifted adults. And
Thanks. I took the Mesquite, which is it's the only emotional intelligence test that's considered abilities based right now, and I got these asynchronous scores. So I scored really, really high on aspects of emotional intelligence that has to do with emotional management, and kind of curious scores when it came to perceiving emotions or knowing what to do with other people's emotional data that they present. Um, Later on in life, like literally last year, I took an autism test for adults, and to my surprise, I scored on the spectrum. My sister, who is a board certified behavior analyst, she works exclusively with autistic people. She was not surprised at all. She just never bothered to tell me. So that was pretty eye-opening. So I'm learning some emotional intelligence skills. In terms of business, I have occasionally been exploited because of those weaknesses. But thankfully, I partnered up with someone recently that is one of her strengths. She's exceptionally good at emotional intelligence, and the partnership has resulted in our company blossoming faster than I actually had anticipated. And it's also part of the reason why Elysian Trust has multiple cognitive ability groups. We have a high IQ society named Volant that Joy mentioned earlier, but we also have one for emotional intelligence named Wavelength. And it's because that ability really does come in handy. And it's remarkable when you see someone who has a very high range skill in that. I just wish it was me. So, anyway, but back to you, Joy.
Moving on to intuition. I never thought about intuition until a male colleague kept saying I was so intuitive, the most intuitive person he'd ever met. This confused me for a long time because I felt like my thoughts and ideas came from pure logic and reason. Doesn't everyone have thoughts and make decisions that stem from the sum of their knowledge and experiences? Perhaps not. I think of my intuition as the ability to let a response bubble up through my psyche, my full synthesis of all I've ever experienced automatically. Sometimes I intentionally don't script myself. I'd rather see what just comes out. My father once said the Holy Spirit told him I'd been out too late at night. I scoffed. Obviously, it was just him. He knew I'd been out too late. But later I realized that he was likely referring to his own intuition and learned to respect the veracity of what the Holy Spirit was telling him. Sometimes I want to do something, and as a powerful woman who's capable of getting all sorts of things done, it's weird when sometimes something slows me down, and I attribute this to my intuition too. For example, in 2016, I decided I wanted to do my 20th high school reunion in October 2021 to coincide with a 5-year festival back home. In 2017, I hit this hard: surveys, getting class captains, etc. But then I just sat on it for years. I didn't know why and frequently felt anxious about it, but I still didn't take any action. Around December 2019, I forced myself to start looking at some hotels, but still didn't put down a deposit. When the pandemic started around March 2020, and people said, we're just going to work from home for 2 weeks, I started expressing that I felt it would last much longer and it might even affect my reunion, which it totally did. Last fall, we had our 20th on Discord instead. My rational skills are strong, and with great effort, I can override my gut feelings, but I usually end up with some level of regret. My logistics abilities do insulate me from very bad outcomes, though. I've learned to trust my intuition and work to refine my inner voice. Chris?
Thanks, Joy. For this section, I drew on Davidson and Begley's book, The Emotional Life of Your Brain, and their social intuition dimension. I have strong social intuition, and it's something that comes out very clearly in my clinical work. I have an excellent ability to pick up on nonverbal cues, and I can read people's body language, vocal intonation, and facial expressions. My empathy and attunement to the emotional states of others are really the foundation of the work I do in helping people heal from trauma. Having strong social intuition helps me pick up on how my clients are feeling in real time, and it allows me to feel their emotions even when it's not obvious in their words. It also helps me maintain an awareness of how they're doing emotionally when we're meeting. So intuition was a big part of developing relationships in my life, and this is where I learned the most lessons. I'm the kind of person who has been feeling my way through life. When I was a kid, people treated me as though I was just my intellect, and I'm actually someone who feels very deeply. But I didn't know how to handle my emotions, and I was completely overwhelmed by them when I was young. And it feels like much of my life has been a process of learning how to handle these aspects of myself and channeling them in healthier ways. And so, speaking of that, I wanted to just mention that I was able to integrate the experience of having two realities that I mentioned earlier, and intuition was important in guiding that process. For the past few years, I've finally been living in one reality, and it has helped me make good progress in my work, and it's also just a healthier way to live. And
Thanks. As I mentioned earlier, I had a long history of having intuitive pops while in class on tests, and the answer would be correct, but I couldn't show any work whatsoever, so I get like 50% on it. I am keenly aware that I'm not unique. There are a lot of kids right now in schools right now who are like me, they were intuitive, they still are, and the school system does not know what to do with them. Uh, there are some countries that are working on that, like Japan, for instance. But for the most part, these kids are, except for maybe sports and arts, there's no outlet for them to develop their abilities. And it's unfortunate because I can tell you, once you get out of school, there is a high demand for people with strong intuitions and pretty much any domain you can imagine. I'm probably one of the few people who's actually been hired to intuit stocks for a trading company. I can tell you that there's plenty of universities, including University of Virginia, where I'm tested, where there are always looking for people with remarkable intuitive skills that they can see what you can do. And it's also, again, not plugging Allegiant Trust all the time, but again, that is why we have a cognitive ability set aside for people who demonstrate remarkable intuition too. We'd like to work backwards and find out where all the ways that that ability can be applied to, especially in school, because again, we are missing out on a strong resource that's actually built into every community. Thanks, Joy.
Now we'll touch on talent development and career exploration. The first step in talent development is talent exposure. My mother enrolled me in so many extracurriculars: tap, ballet, gymnastics, gifted and talented camps through public schools, Girl Scouts, softball, bowling, charm school, and more. I got many dolls, but wasn't allowed Legos or video games as a child. Those were boys' toys. Around third grade, my mom did give me a fifth grade math textbook that I devoured. I was a voracious reader in my childhood, especially once I learned that things adults wouldn't teach me yet could be easily accessed at my local library with some dewy decimal sleuthing. Because I was relatively better than my peers at a majority of subjects such as math, those were the talents my schools kept nurturing. However, just because I have talents in areas, it doesn't mean I'm interested in them or that I enjoy using those skills. Sometimes I try to hide or minimize my abilities to limit others' exploitation of me. I mentioned that I'm a multipotentialite. I've been near paralyzed with fear of premature foreclosure. If I choose X, does that mean I can never do Y? I want to try it all. I love to take in ideas from different areas and fuse them together. While career exploration is important, luck and circumstance have strongly influenced my career path and how I got to where I am today. I'm a strong advocate for early career exploration for gifted students. They should get to know what jobs are out there and that they can create jobs that don't even exist yet. I want more opportunities for students to learn about careers at younger ages before paying for years of tuition. I'm left wondering, does society own our gifts? How much do I have to do things I dislike because of my relative talent levels? Will I or my ideas be exploited by others? What vocations will fulfill my ikigai or reason for being? How can I forge a path in society that nurtures my soul, develops my strengths, benefits my communities, and supports a happy and healthy lifestyle? Chris?
Thanks, Joy. Well, I barely graduated high school because I was always more focused on my own projects and interests than on school. But I wrote a book during the last months of high school that was published when I was 20. And so I've been an author since I was young, and writing has been a major part of my life, as I've already mentioned, a constant in my life, really. And it's a huge component of my emotional regulation as well. But my talents were not developed when I was young. I went to college right after high school, but I left after 2 years and I was still a freshman in credits. And during the time that I was struggling between the ages of 21 and 26, I started semesters and failed to finish 5 times at 4 different schools. And then I tried again at age 28 at a community college, and suddenly I figured out how to be a student and I was able to do very well. I went on to get a master's degree in social work and a PhD in psychology. And I realized that my work over the past several years, especially the way I've been learning with Michael, has been the first time in my life when I felt like I'm really working to my potential. It finally feels like I'm developing my talents. I mean, when I was growing up, I always had not working to her potential on my report cards. And school was like torture for me in many ways. You know, I didn't do homework, I didn't attend classes regularly. Everyone around me meant well and tried to help, but I was living in a different reality. I mean, my needs for mental stimulation and the energy that I deal with because of my mind are significant and in ways that are unfathomable for most people. The experience of profound giftedness has been difficult for me to manage. And what I'm learning as I keep finding people like me is that this is actually a pretty common PG experience that I've had. And I mean, we need more research on the highly and profoundly gifted.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. In terms of talent development and career exploration, I did quite a bit of that without much guidance or direction growing up. I really had to find my own way, not that I wanted to. I've been in the Navy, I've been a security guard, I've been a biotechnologist, you name it, I've done it, hotel manager. But along the way, I did wind up crafting my own path. And ironically, I guess you could say my whole job these days is to support talent in others. So with Allegiant Trust, we find people who have these remarkable abilities and we try to figure out what their dreams are. And then we help them become reality. Uh, Typically, there's a money issue blocking them getting success. So that's where I work as a grant writer to get grants for them. But there's also, I guess you could call it job placement in a way. So we also find jobs or even help them craft jobs that don't exist yet that fully take advantage of their talents. And it's a lesson I'm learning myself as well. I used to give away a lot of my work for free because it didn't seem like it was valuable to me. It wasn't until I partnered up with the person I did, her name is Elizabeth Ringley. She realized these are talents that need to be monetized. You will make a lot of money. And she was right. I had no idea that I had that kind of value. So that's not a lesson that's unique to me. There's quite a few people who need that lesson as well. Joy.
For our final prompt, we will discuss saving the world and our hopes for the future. In general, I want to save the world and have great hopes for the future. Some of my other strengths are ideation and a deep interest in futurism. As much as I'm concerned about the Earth, I am anxious about the impact and governance of humanity as we expand across our galaxy. I love to think about, create, and refine new ideas, but often am hesitant to implement anything without systemic buy-in and collaboration. If I do something on my own, it won't make as large of an impact as it would if I worked with others. And too often, my idea will just get beaten down by others who don't share my vision or can't. I seek out organizations like Allegiant Trust and the Gordian Knot Society to strive toward more collective positive impact with other able, creative, and motivated individuals. There's perpetual tension around whose way? My way? How much should I listen to the voices and opinions of others? When should I completely reject what others desire? Who can be that arbiter? Me? Some of my ideas and desires are so different from our current reality. I know people are uncomfortable with discrete change and need clear and continuous steps before moving toward a creative vision. But I get impatient and discouraged with some of our global decision-making processes. I think one of the best strategies for me to embed new ideas in our zeitgeist is for me to become a fiction writer. I'm all about that long game. If we're lucky, we invest heavily in gifted education, preschool through high school, but not enough is done when students graduate in post-secondary and career education. My professional area of passion is in supporting the career development and well-being of the gifted. I hope that by nurturing ever better humans, some of whom have high levels of ability and share our concerns around morality and justice, more people will use their gifts for the thriving of our whole. Chris?
Thanks, Joy. Well, when I first came to the field of gifted education, I felt an urgent need to help people and to create change beyond myself. I really wanted to save the world. And I went through a process of going to conferences, meeting scholars in the field, talking with them about my story, and asking for advice. And everyone nudged me in the direction of Dabrowski's theory. And I'm so grateful for the warm welcome that I received when I found Gifted Ed, and I'm honored to have this opportunity to share my experiences today. Now that I have a private practice and I work with highly and profoundly gifted clients, I find that the inner work that I've done informs how I help them. And I've been surprised to realize that much of the work with these people is helping them resolve a lifetime of gifted related traumas. The experience of overexcitability that we share is often pathologized. It looks so different from the norm, and it's so over the top that it's easy for professionals to see it as something wrong and in need of being fixed. The field of gifted ed has not done enough to support the experience of being gifted and people who are profoundly gifted. But across all types of giftedness, we have to work harder to bridge the divide between theory and practice. Those of us who work in this community support parents and adults as well as children. When educators, therapists, doctors, and other professionals are faced with a highly or profoundly gifted person, they often don't know what to do. But there are data available on these populations. We just haven't taken that data and created best practices for working with them, and we need to do better. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn about our experiences today. And
Yeah, thanks. So in terms of saving the world and hopes for the future, I am 100% for the gifted community galvanizing ourselves in doing that. But I do believe it's unrealistic to expect us to solely solve the world's problems when we aren't the ones who solely made them. I was surprised around last year, I started doing research on the factors of success. And maybe not a shock to most of the people who are attending this today. For me, I was very surprised to learn that the top two factors for success are wealth and luck. Gifts and talents and tenacity and grit, they're in the top four too, but they're under those two things. I can tell you that there are plenty of people in Elysian Trust. We're more than happy to provide the brain power, to provide the tenacity, the passion, the talents, the grits, all those factors. But we still would need to work with other organizations to bring home the wealth. And I'm not just talking about financial wealth, it's also social, in terms of social capital. And even then, you're going to need luck to, but I do believe the problems can be solved. Back in 2017, parts of Elysian Trust, we had like 4 or 5 members. We competed in MIT Solve, and we came up with a solution for their problem that year. And we got close to winning, but they ultimately decided our solution was too impractical. Fast forward to 2020, Google actually ran our project. So, I mean, instead of seeing it as a competition or anything like that, I'd love to see it as a collaboration where we could actually, again, pull together all our resources, our mental ones, but other people's financial ones, the social ones, and work together and actually solve things. They can be solved. I absolutely believe that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris and Nth, so much. We might have time for one question or two in the chat. Please put it in the formal Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. But Chris and Nth, it was such a pleasure learning about your stories and, like I said, being inspired by our moreness. And anyway, this was just such a special opportunity for me. Thank you guys for participating. Elizabeth, I think, did have a question around the organization. The organization Nth is the founder of is Elysian Trust, and there is a link to that on the Highly and Profoundly Gifted resource page that I linked to in the chat. It's also available on our website.
You also have my email. Feel free to email me.
All right. Maybe we just did a really good job with our timing. I'm really impressed with this. Way to go. Okay. Then I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us for this panel. A list of resources is available on the conference website. We will now take a brief break. Please return at 2 p.m. or at 1:55 p.m. for Latinx and ELL gifted students with Drs. Michelle Dubois and Dr. Robin Green. We'll see you then. Thank you.